hope I have enough to say to interest you, but I do have an important topic to talk about, and it's the crossroads our nation is at right now, and I think the topic of my remarks has already been advertised. I want to talk a little bit about state and federal power and where we are in our American experience right now. You know, when people are taught in high school, sometimes they're taught things that aren't exactly accurate. Sometimes kids are taught that America was the first democracy. No, we weren't. The Romans had democracy more than 1,000 years before we did, and the Swiss had a democratic.
When all aliens reside with you in your land, you shall oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be with you as the citizens among you. You shall love the alien as yourself.
Get that fascist out of here.
In the land of Egypt, I am with you in your Lord. Kris Kobach, you do not represent Kansas values.
Yeah, I'd be happy to address your questions afterwards.
Please do not
Happy to talk about Kansas values. And you are an American value. One of the quintessential American values, this is where I was going with this, is, you know, we weren't the first democracy. We weren't the first representative system. The British Parliament already had that. But we were the first system that tried to limit government with a written constitution. The idea of putting government in a cage.
If you'd like to go into the room today through the end down there, I need to close the doors for my dining room.
That is the American contribution to civilization on the science of government. That is, and countries around the world today define themselves by having a constitution similar to America's.
Kick us out of our table. Gosh.
Thank you.
As I was saying, you know, we also have a tradition in America of vigorous debate and respectful debate, and sometimes some people misunderstand that. Look, the American system of limiting government was the absolute quintessential innovation and insight that our founding fathers had. And one of the ways they intended to limit government was not just to limit its scope in terms of the actual areas it was regulating, but the idea was that the federal government in particular would have limited powers, whereas the state governments would have undefined, unenumerated, much broader powers. And I just want to read a quote from James Madison for you. Now, this is how James Madison, he was trying to sell the American Constitution at the time of its ratification to people who were doubtful that the American Constitution would protect states' rights. And he said, don't worry, the new central government is not going to be too large under this system. And he wrote this in Federalist 45 on January 26, 1788. This is James Madison advocating for the new American federal constitution. He said, quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people." That's how government works.
Mr. Kobach, in 2009, immigrants have consistently contributed to our economy.
This is private property. There we go.
Very interesting. Well,
Armando and David still.
Look, all of the things that affect your ordinary lives, if there's any government that's going to regulate that, it's going to be the state governments. The federal government is going to be concerned with essentially external affairs, war, foreign relations, and the federal government's not going to affect your lives in any significant way. And that's the way the American system actually functioned for almost 150 years. It wasn't until the 1930s that even began to change at all. If anything significant was going to be done to regulate people's lives, it was going to be done by the state governments. But then there was a real significant assault on state autonomy and state authority, and this whole balance, of course, in the 1930s with the New Deal. And the Supreme Court initially held back, and the Supreme Court struck down a number of the New Deal programs that vastly expanded federal authority. But then you know the rest of the story. There was the court packing plan, which was an effort by the Roosevelt administration to intimidate the Supreme Court. It worked. In 1937, there was a so-called switch in time at Save 9, which is where the court basically switched and buckled. 2 justices changed their positions. Instead of being a 5-4 majority to retain our old structure of states' rights and state sovereignty, then it became a 6-3 majority, and the federal government the other way, and the federal government was able to expand, and that happened in 1937. Well, that was the last time we were at a crossroads as a nation about whether we were going to have our founding fathers' vision, where state governments close to the people could define and in any way regulate what was going on in people's lives, versus this centralized vision, which we now have today. Well, we're now at another crossroads, and there's now another assault on states' rights. And it's every bit as strong, indeed, I would say now, under this administration in Washington, is perhaps even stronger than what happened in 1937, the assault on states' rights. And I want to suggest that it's going on in ways that are more pernicious, too. In 1937, the way it happened was that the federal government just expanded. And as it expanded, it displaced the states, because Article 6 of our Constitution has the supremacy clause, and it says essentially that if the federal government passes a law and a state law is in conflict, or even a state constitutional provision is in conflict with that law, the federal law trumps it. The state law is null and void. And so as the federal government expanded, it pushed out all of these countervailing state laws in these areas. Well, it was sort of an indirect way of pushing the states off the field. Now, it's more pernicious. The federal government is expanding in the same way again, but the federal government is also attacking.
Documented students who have studied
Get the fashion
I'd encourage if that gentleman has any more friends who would like to, if you've got a piece of paper that somebody else wrote for you on a piece of paper, maybe ask an intelligent question.
You guys aren't, you're not
No, that was Armando. We still have one. We also got a guy right here.
I'm here for the show. Chief in a moment. But seriously, if you have something you want to say, ask it in your own voice. Don't just read something off a piece of paper. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Indeed, I'll be talking about illegal immigration in a moment. So, try to have some courage.
Can you tell us how often you've interrupted them and their meetings like this? Have you ever had occasion
isn't it
to do
interesting
that?
how the left loves to disrupt a banquet like this, a lunch like this, when we can all have interplay and we can ask questions. But instead of asking questions and actually formulating points coherently, it's just disrupting and reading things that other people have written. But hopefully their cohorts will improve as we go along. Okay, so
show some respect. Let's go. Let's go. Show some respect and wait till you turn. I do not want to wait until home. He's not a member. Respect.
Yeah, we'll do Q&A after.
You're being asked to leave, sir. Then asked to leave. It's a private meeting.
Yeah,
Yes, it is. The way the Kansas Open Meetings Act works. This is a private meeting.
Hey, fascist. Hitler did that kind of thing.
Oh, you all
we're
don't
not
know
a
any more
government
than
body here. I
nothing.
don't think this is an open
I'm
meeting.
leaving.
It is an open meeting. It is an open meeting.
No hate in our state! No hate in our state! No hate!